This video might ruin movies for you. If you're wanting to write stories for the screen, it's must-have information, but if you just want to enjoy movies, you may actually want to just click off. It's going to be okay, I won't be offended. Thank you for watching, subscribing, I really do appreciate it. If you're finding value, please be sure to hit those buttons. Let's jump in. What's the secret screenwriting trick? What do you mean there's a secret one? Like, what do you mean? I've got to know things. It's like, no, this is just one that people don't talk about a whole lot, but it's present in every story. So this is actually going to help you understand a little bit better how stories are structured. We might understand Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, right? Beginning, middle, end. But there's actually a little bit more to that. And the answer lies in what are called sequences. Now, a sequence is a series or a group of scenes that belong to someone, and they revolve around an event, and they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's what a sequence is at its core level. In a way, you can think of a sequence as like a mini movie. Each sequence kind of has its own Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And if you understand what a main tension is in Act 2, that is what's holding the whole second act of a movie together. Each sequence has its own little main tension. It's little main tension that holds the sequence together. It's a group of scenes that belong to someone. Will someone do blank or blank? Will they do this? Yes or no? And that's what a little sequence is. Typically, in a movie, there are 8 sequences. Sometimes there's 7, sometimes there's 9, sometimes there's a few more if it's a longer or historical epic kind of a film. So sometimes there can be more. But generally, there are 8 sequences. And each sequence is roughly 12 to 15 minutes long. So if you're writing in your script, you might have every 10 or 15 pages or so a sequence. There's a group of scenes that belong to someone that revolve around an event. There's a beginning, a middle, and end for that little sequence. Now, please don't confuse how I'm using sequence when I'm talking about structure to how some people might also use the word sequence to talk about like the car chase sequence or the escape sequence. And honestly, that's why sometimes filmmaking and screenwriting is a little confusing, because they use the same word that describes multiple things, and it's just hard to kind of keep track. So I get it, and I'm sorry, but that's just what they're called. So they're called sequences, and we're talking about the structural part of that and how they work. So typically there are 8 of them. There are 12 to 15 minutes long, give or take. And one of the reasons for this is actually historical. When we were shooting film on actual film and on actual reels, each reel would hold about 12 to 15 minutes. And then you would put those reels in what were called bins. So if you're familiar with video editing, you use bins to help organize your stuff, and that's where that term comes from. So you have all these reels, and each reel was kind of its own sequence. It helped people keep track of the story without having to scroll through the whole thing, because it was all on a film strip, right? But if I have them all in like smaller chunks, here's this 12 to 15 minute chunk, here's this 12 to 15 minute chunk. Now I can pretty easily find what I'm wanting to find for my movie. The other part of it is, if you think about movies, they're generally an hour and a half to 2 hours long. Well, how long is 8 12-minute sequences? 96 minutes, about an hour and a half. How long are 8 15-minute sequences? 2 hours. So that's kind of where they're coming from. So if it helps you to think about it like that, great. So what are those 8 sequences? Now, keep in mind, I'm going to go through them here pretty quick, and they should generally make sense, especially if you understand kind of 3-act structure and how that works. I'll try to link a video. So just keep in mind, I'm not really going full depth here. The other thing to realize is that you can move these sequences around. So sometimes in a movie you're watching, all these things happen, but they don't always happen in chronological order like how I'm going to walk through them. So commonly, this is the order they're in. The first sequence is establishing a routine. This pairs a lot with, in a 3-act structure, with status quo. What's status quo? What's the routine? What's going on? Will my character get through a day? Okay, that may be the question that's holding that little sequence together. Just simply establishing a routine. Next comes where you're setting up the predicament. And this typically starts, the sequence typically starts after the inciting incident. So the inciting incident happens, kicks the main character out of their status quo, and now we're in the second sequence. Typically, not always. Again, I'm talking like broad strokes here. So now we're setting up the predicament. And really the question of that is, will the character choose to engage in this event or whatever for the story or not? Or are they going to try to avoid the thing? Like, are they being called to do something, or are they running away from it? Like, what are they going to do? So we're setting up the predicament, and then we're going to see what's going to happen. Then we're in the second act. So the second act sequences the first one of the second act, which is number 3. We start introducing our subplots. So we might find out what the villain is actually after and what he's trying to do, or something like that, or what the best friend is trying to do. We might get introduced to some of those while our main character is still moving toward their goal. The fourth sequence is typically revolving around rising stakes, rising action, as we're working our way toward the midpoint of the story, and we're finding out, okay, our characters might try to do this thing. Are they going to succeed or not? And maybe they do, but it's false, or they don't, and so now they kind of decide to keep going, and now we're into the second half of the second act. So the fifth sequence is about where the subplots start to take hold. We really start to see, what's the best friend doing? What's the villain doing? Ooh, it looks like the villain's going to succeed. Now we're really worried because our main character kind of failed at the midpoint, and so now we're trucking along, and it's not looking good for our main character. So all the subplots are taking hold. They're like becoming more formidable and opposing our main character. The sixth sequence is about building up to the culmination. The culmination is the answer to our second act question, our main tension, everything that's holding the second act together. So that sixth sequence is building up to that. Then we're in the third act. And the third act, typically the first sequence of the third act is, what is the new predicament? There's a new predicament, there's a new complication, there's something new that's happened, so now we're off and going that direction. And then we end with a resolution, so we're going to get back to a new status quo. Those are typically the 8 sequences. Now, do you need all of them? No. Sometimes there's extra ones, sometimes some of those kind of repeat. Maybe they might do the rising stakes and action for the main character, maybe do rising stakes and action for the villain, and we might have those going at the same time, or one right after the other, or something like that. So sometimes you can have more, you can have less, you don't have to have all of them, but these are the things that typically help you structure a film. So if you look at the whole 3-act structure, you have 2 sequences in the first act, 4 in the second, and 2 in the third. So our first 30 minutes of the movie, our middle 60 minutes, our last 30 minutes, if that helps you to think about it. First 30 pages, middle 60 pages, last 30 pages. This is why sometimes when you look at story mapping things, they say, well, this should happen about on page 15. This should happen about on page 60. It's because they're thinking like, hey, the midpoint should be roughly in the middle, which is the end of that sequence. So here's kind of how it goes. Now, the thing that will really help you start to understand and how to structure your own stories if you're trying to write stories, or how to break down a story if you're trying to break it down, is that each sequence should have its own Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. So each one of those 8 has its own little movie, in a sense. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. And that actually helps you break down your story. So if you're having trouble plotting or having trouble figuring out what happens, that's a really great way, using sequences, to figure out, what do I need to do? What should happen here? How should I structurally break this apart? Maybe you're thinking about, okay, but I like to write short films, or I like to write short stories. How does this apply? Actually, it applies perfectly. Most really good short stories or short films are either sequence 2 or sequence 4. Why? Well, sequence 2 is about the status quo being disrupted, and there's this new thing. So we might get a little glimpse of a status quo, the character doing life as normal, and something disrupts it. And then it's like, is the character going to do this thing or not? And we're watching this short, we're reading this short, and we get to the end, and it's like the character's definitely going to do it, or the character's not going to do it. They're going to try to avoid it. And we're either happy or we're sad, right? But that's kind of a complete story. Sequence 4 is another very popular one for short films. Why? Well, because the character is really trying to decide to solve this thing. They do the thing they're trying to do, but they either succeed and it's a false win, so they think they've won only to realize they've lost, or they fail and they want to really decide, no, I'm going to go after this thing even more. One of those is an uplifting story, one of those is kind of depressing story. But those are the common things for short stories and short films. So if you want to write short stories and short films, if you think about them in a broader story, so what if your short film or short story was part of a larger story? What was that larger story? Now break it down to that, and you're going to have a really good and satisfying short film, short story. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. If it has, if you found value, please like, subscribe, bell. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. Happy writing, and if you're going to tell a story that matters. See you later.